It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP George Freeman, Labour MP Andrew Gwynn, Emily Carver from free market think tank the Institute of Economic Affairs, and columnist and Times radio presenter Ayesha Hazarika. Today, if care home workers don't get a jab within 16 weeks, they risk losing their job.
We need to make sure we get the balance right, but I'm sure people appreciate that protecting lives is the absolute priority.
Mandatory jabs for NHS staff in England could follow. We'll bring you Prime Minister's questions live at noon.
You can't run society purely to stop the hospitals being full, otherwise you'd never let us get in our cars and drive anywhere or do any of the other things that people want to do.
That's not an angry backbencher speaking, but a cabinet minister. And remember summer last year?
6 days in August, when temperatures in the southeast were 10 degrees above normal. And it's going to get worse.
More on that later, but let's return to the top story in the headlines there and show you the Guardian headline. COVID vaccinations to be made mandatory for care home staff. The BBC has been told that staff in care homes for older people will have to have vaccination. In England, we understand the government will also open a consultation on requiring vaccines as a condition of employment for NHS staff, also in England. So, mandatory vaccines for care home staff. My opening question to all of you, is it the right move?
Well, I think I've got 49 care homes in my constituency. Norfolk is a very big care county. And I think people understand that if you're in a care home, you expect staff. And I think the vast majority of staff in care homes in my constituency would want to be vaccinated, expect to be, and see that as a fundamental part of providing good care to the elderly in homes. So I don't have a problem with it. I think Liz Truss is right. The health and safety of people in care homes comes first. And I'd be very surprised if healthcare workers don't want to have the vaccination.
Interestingly, Unison, the union, has put out a press release saying they're worried it might drive away staff.
I'd be surprised by that. The people I see who work in care homes are really dedicated to the health and the care of people in those homes. They're healthcare workers, professionals on the front line. I'd be very surprised if really they are resistant to having the vaccine. I think Unison are probably getting ahead of themselves. I don't see a big problem locally.
Andrew, is it the right move?
I mean, instinctively, I don't like forcing anybody to do something that they don't want to do, and particularly when it comes to healthcare and things like vaccinations. Look, I've had both of my jabs. I think the vaccination programme has been a great success. It's our route out of this pandemic to a large extent, and we should be encouraging everybody and anybody to have their vaccinations. But I don't want to force people who don't want to do that. But there are rights and responsibilities here, and I think that somebody in a care home or a family of somebody in a care home should have the right to expect that their loved one is safe and that the staff have taken all precautions to keep them safe. It's a really difficult decision here, and I'm not sure what the answer is. The government's clearly come to the conclusion it's making it mandatory.
But you're not absolutely sure whether it should be.
I don't like making things mandatory, but I do understand and accept that somebody in a care home is vulnerable and they need to have that full protection, including the protection from the staff bringing the virus in.
Emily, what do you think? Has the government done the right thing?
You know, I'm a little bit torn on this. I do see the common sense argument that, you know, all care home staff should be vaccinated to protect elderly patients. That does seem a little bit of a no-brainer. But, you know, I do. And also there's the worry that, you know, if care home staff don't understand the logic of vaccination or don't buy into it for whatever reason, they may also not understand, you know, other safety precautions like, you know, sanitizing or other cleanliness. But I do worry that it may sort of we may end up in a position where where it's illegal to refuse the jab, that so many jobs in the private sector as well as the rest of the public sector may demand this legally or make it mandatory. And I do find that concerning because ethically and morally.
Aisha.
Well, look, I would very much like every care worker and every NHS worker. I'd like every adult in this country to get the vaccine. So I'm very much in agreement with people. But then there is the practicality. I think you can't actually force somebody to get a jab. You can't sort of run at them with a needle. And if care staff do choose to leave, that's going to cause a pragmatic, practical problem. There are already shortages in the care sector. There have been some care home providers out this morning on broadcast saying, look, we're all on the same page, right? But if a whole load of people refuse to get the vaccine and leave, we're going to have a massive problem when there are already shortages. So I think encouragement is an explanation is probably a better way rather than forcing people. But it is difficult. As Emily said, there's big, ethical concerns around this.
Right. Well, the government is obviously trying to turbo boost vaccinations, the levels of them before July the 19th, which is when the restrictions have been delayed until there is a vote happening this evening in the House of Commons. Not everyone is happy, of course, particularly a group of Conservative MPs. But Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House of Commons, was talking to Conservative Home about this.
Ultimately, the NHS is there to serve the British people, not the British people there to serve the NHS. And therefore, we may need to spend more money on hospitals. But you can't run society purely to stop the hospitals being full. Otherwise, you'd never let us get in our cars and drive anywhere or do any of the other things that people want to do. So there has to be some proportionality within that. The government doesn't have the right to take charge of people's lives purely to prevent them seeing the doctor.
Is he right, George? You can't just run society to stop the hospitals becoming full?
I think his central point that we need to deal with this pandemic, but we mustn't get to a point where we start to control people's lives on the basis of what public services can cope with. And that is the thin end of the wedge. I happen to think the public are with us on the vaccination programme, and I think they're with us on making sure that we make sure that hospitals are not overwhelmed. I mean, we were very close last spring to a serious crisis. I think the public support that. But I think the point Jacob's making is, there's a thin end of the wedge. And what we don't want to do as a society is start saying your freedoms are being curtailed here, here and here because it's inconvenient for the government and public services. And I think he's right to make that point. But equally, it is vital that we get as many people vaccinated as possible, that we build resistance in the community and we prevent our hospitals being overwhelmed, not least because there is a huge backlog from COVID that's got to be cleared.
Right. I mean, Andrew, you're backing the government's extension of restrictions broadly, but are you prepared to take a calculated risk at that point on July the 19th?
Well, look, I've always been very sceptical about some of these measures and in the past have voted against, for example, the extension of the Coronavirus Act, because I do think there has to be a balance between returning to normality and tackling this pandemic. The vaccination programme is absolutely the route to achieving that. And the more people we get vaccinated, the less of the pressure there is on the hospital system. We are in a very, very different place today than we were this time last year, where there was a very serious risk of our hospital system being overwhelmed. The reason that Greater Manchester, my constituency, has been under local measures of one form or another since the 29th of July last year was precisely to protect the NHS in Greater Manchester from being overwhelmed. We are a million miles from that now.
Right, so do you think they're not necessary then? It's not necessary to extend it?
Well, I think there will clearly need to be restrictions, but I think what we've got to do is turbocharge that vaccination programme, get more people vaccinated, and then we can start to ease up on these restrictions. We need a bit of normality. It's been a long time in my constituency, since the 29th of July, we've had some form of restrictions, and actually we need to see the light at the end of the tunnel. This tunnel just keeps on getting longer, Jo.
Right, I mean, Emily, there were 10 reported deaths from COVID yesterday. How should the government balance the cost of human life to the costs of ongoing restrictions?
And I think the government have had the balance wrong for a while now. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg is completely right when he says, we need some more proportionality when it comes to these restrictions. We were told not that long ago that when the vulnerable groups had been vaccinated, then we could get rid of restrictions, all, social distancing restrictions and so on. We were then told we'd have freedom by June the 21st. Now it seems almost indefinite. There's, still a maybe over July the 19th. So, at the moment, the stated justification by government is that we need to prevent ICU from being overwhelmed by getting more people jabs and, buying time in that way. But what's to say that by July the 19th, ICU will still not be, under risk of being overwhelmed? It may well be the case. And then we move on into, the autumn months and then into the winter. And you can just see these restrictions continuing on in one way or another. And I think a lot of people are very frightened that the government has got to the stage where its whole pandemic policy is being almost dictated to by a very narrow clique of scientific advisors whose first priority has and always will be to prevent COVID deaths. And I'm worrying that we're approaching a zero COVID approach to this. And I don't think that's healthy for our society.
Right, I'll get George to respond. But Emily, you're saying that we should learn to live with 10 deaths a day, for example. I think you might have just lost. Did you hear the question, Emily?
Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so you're saying we should live with 10 deaths a day from COVID?
I think we should, yes.
George?
I think Emily makes a really important point about health economics. One of the problems through this pandemic has been that we have neglected health economics. And in the end, these are balanced decisions. The cost of shutting down the economy has a massive cost on livelihoods, mental health, locking people up. And we've lost, I think, in recent decades, the ability to really measure that.
But Emily has said it's had it wrong, that balance, up until now, and it looks like it's pursuing a zero COVID strategy.
Well, I think the Prime Minister's signalling that he's trying to get the balance right between opening up, giving people the freedom. People have been through incredible sacrifices, but making sure that at the same time, we don't trigger a third wave, which would trigger an autumn lockdown. They're difficult decisions, but I think Emily's right to signal that, public health experts have no remit to think about the economy. They have absolutely no responsibility to the economy, fair enough, but the government does, and the cabinet do, and we do need to balance these decisions, as I think the government's trying to do.
Aisha?
Well, look, nobody wants to have another lockdown, but I think we've also got to be realistic. All this talk of Freedom Day and pinning dates to things is very, very difficult. This is what the government was trying to avoid. We've just had this killer global pandemic. The idea that just because some of us are a bit sick and tired of it, we're just declaring that it's all over. It may well come back. There may be a new variant that outfoxes the vaccine. Let's pray that doesn't happen. We know that the autumn into winter could be very difficult with a third wave. And it's not good enough for Jacob Rees-Mogg to just say, oh, well, come on, the public just have to, stop pandering to the NHS. The NHS is the sort of backbone of our society. NHS staff are absolutely knackered having gone through the pandemic. As George said, there's a massive backlog of really important elective surgeries and other very important treatment that needs to happen. So you don't want loads of people going into hospital with COVID right now and diverting resources. There's also the thing of long COVID as well. Lots of people may not be getting as ill as they did, but we know long COVID is an issue. And the other thing I would say is that nobody wants another lockdown. Who does? I mean, everyone has struggled with this. Businesses have struggled. We've all struggled with our mental health. Why hasn't the government done the business on the borders as well? It's all very well, chiding us and saying, look, get used to living with this and there will be some deaths and having a go at care home workers. Why doesn't the government protect the borders? That was like a really basic thing that they could have done. And, maybe we would have hit that Freedom Day if this Delta variant, the so-called Indian variant, hadn't been allowed to come here and rip again through these shores.
Well, we may well be discussing that after PMQs if Keir Starmer intends to ask questions about that very issue, Aisha. Emily, you were shaking your head at what Aisha was saying at the beginning of her response there in terms of the NHS. Why?
Well, I was just thinking that it's very easy for people who are I'm not referring to Aisha here, I'm just talking in general. It's very easy for people who are in secure jobs, whether they're in the public sector or they can work from home or so on, to to talk about how lockdown, it's just a couple more weeks. If that secures the NHS for, a few more weeks, months, and so on, that's fine. But the problem is, for a lot of people in this country, these restrictions that are still in place, and there are still a lot of restrictions in place, are preventing businesses from making a profit. And the impact of that, not only on the economy, but also on mental health, is huge. And I do think the government needs to balance that in a more balanced way against the risk of COVID, because as we know, people die every day of very many diseases, very many, cancer, heart disease, and so on. And I think there is a desperate need for some balance here.
Aisha?
Well, the first duty of government is to protect life. And the problem is, because the government dithered so much at the beginning, and because they actually put the economy over people's health, we have ended up in this nightmare situation where we have this shamefully high death toll. And to Emily's point, which I agree, who wants the economy to suffer? I'm a freelancer. I've lost tons of work because of this. I work and know a lot of people in theatre. They're really struggling with it. Nobody wants these lockdowns. But if you let your society get sick and you let your hospitals get overwhelmed, then you're going to have to lock down, and that is going to hurt the economy. I've spoken to people in theatre this week who are tearing their hair out over the delay to this June 21st, but they don't also want people to come to the theatre and get sick. They don't want that either. Most people do have a proportionate attitude to this. Yeah. But if the government had made the right balance and put people's health over the economy right at the beginning, we might have been in a very different situation.
Emily?
But it's very easy to look back with hindsight and say the government should have done this, the government should have done that. But we are where we are now. And I think a lot of people, an increasing number of people in this country, are looking at the data and thinking, does this really justify this level of restrictions on our lives? Because, the hospitalizations, as Joe said, are down to single figures now on most days, deaths, and hospitalizations are also down despite the variant. So, I think there does need to be, as I said before, a level of balance here. And the government, who have fear-mongered throughout this, they spent, I think, 300 million last year on advertising campaigns, essentially to scare people into obeying the lockdown measures that they weren't sure people would of their own volition. So I think that, there's a lot at play here, and you can't pit the economy against health in that way, because the both aren't mutually exclusive. They're very much intertwined.
Is that what the government's been doing, George? They've been scaremongering.
No, I don't accept scaremongering. The government's first duty is to protect citizens, and telling the public about how dangerous this virus is, shutting down last year, was any government that didn't do it would have been massively abandoning its responsibilities. I think scaremongering is a wholly inappropriate word. But I think Emily's right that we've got to learn to live with this virus. And, we're in a very binary state at the moment, lockdown or open up. The truth is, we're probably going to have to live with a very dangerous virus like flu, which kills 30,000 people every year. And we're going to have to learn to live with it in a way that controls the spread, but minimises the damage to people's livelihoods.
Andrew, perhaps more than us here, sitting here, about the impact of COVID. Aisha mentioned long COVID, and I think the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, talked about 1 million people now suffering with long COVID. Tell us about your experience.
So this is a real worry for the future, because obviously if COVID's going to be with us for the foreseeable future in some form or another, long COVID's going to be with us. So I only had a mild bout of coronavirus at the start of March last year. The illness came and went. It wasn't particularly pleasant, but it wasn't a severe bout of coronavirus, but the symptoms stayed. And they stayed with me for all of 2020 into 2021. I've just about shaken off the worst of it now. I'm probably 99% there, which is why I'm here.
Yeah, very glad to have you here.
But it still comes back, and it manifests itself in different ways. So severe fatigue, sweats like you've been running the London Marathon when you've been doing very little indeed, and brain fog. So very difficult sometimes to string a sentence together. You can see the words in your mind, but you can't grasp them quickly enough. Comes out like gobbledygook. And that's hugely
scary.
Well, particularly for somebody in a job like ours, where communication's a big part of what we do, to not even be able to ask a question without having it written out in front of you in the House of Commons is pretty difficult.
Right. Well, I mean, that is scary and has had a huge impact. I mean, these are one of the things, long COVID and the NHS having to deal with that the country's going to have to get used to.
Yes, and again, that's partly why I support the government taking a strong stance now to try and get this disease under control, because we don't really know yet the full implications. I mean, as it happens, I've now had a double jab. My parents and all of my elderly relatives have. My 2 children have both got COVID. They're 20 and 18, and they're suffering. I mean, really ill. And, you know, people losing taste and smell. We could well find that long COVID is very damaging. And we don't want to look back and say, well, we had a summer of fun, but 1 million young people got long COVID. That would be a disaster.
Andrew?
No, long COVID has to be taken seriously, and I want the government to do more. I mean, it's commendable they've set up these long COVID clinics, but there aren't enough of them. It's very difficult to get referred to them. And, you know, if this is going to be part and parcel of who and what we are for the foreseeable future, and COVID is going to be here, we really need to have proper mechanisms to support those with long COVID. And it has to not just be a health approach, it also has to be recognised, for example, by the DWP. Because if I was having one of my good days and had to go for a work capability assessment, I'd be told, you're fit to work. If it was one of my bad days, I wouldn't. And what you don't want is people to be put into a workplace situation where the employers don't understand about long COVID. And believe me, Joe, if you're having one of your bad days, if you push yourself too much, it can wipe you out for the next 3 or 4 days where you're just good for nothing. I liken it to a game of snakes and ladders. You've really got to get to the top of the board, avoiding all the snakes. And the one snake you've really got to avoid is that last one on the penultimate square.
Where you go all the way to the bottom.
Takes you all the way back to the bottom.
Well, it's very harrowing. You're having a good day.
I'm having a good
I think, today, let me say. We're going to move on. I'm going to just show everybody this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Abandon EU caution and light a bonfire of red tape, Johnson told. By you, George, amongst others, because you're part of a task force of MPs looking at how to take advantage of no longer being subject, as you would put it, to EU regulations. Now, is that what you're trying to do, abandon EU caution?
No, that's a Telegraph headline. We don't actually say in the report, bonfire of red tape, quite specifically. Now, this is important. For 5 years since the referendum, when a lot of things were said about regulation, I think a lot of people have been wondering, well, what is this regulatory dividend? What could it be? And the sceptics have said there is no dividend apart from slashing and burning all our environmental and workers' rights commitments. And others have said, oh, there'll be huge freedoms. Well, we've actually done the work. It's a 120-page report. We took evidence from 75 industry groups, and we've set out a proper framework, a strategic framework for the UK outside of the EU. Firstly, a UK approach to regulation based on UK common law, adopting a proportionality principle. We're not abandoning precaution. Of course, consumer safety and the safety of all of our citizens is vital. But we argue that 40 years of being in the EU has meant that we've really just followed. We've stopped thinking actively about regulation. And for innovation, for leading in the new sectors of tomorrow, the UK has got a huge opportunity. Sure. And we set out 10 sectors here where we call for the UK to use the freedom to lead in setting global standards in nutraceuticals, functional foods, AI, in all of these new areas.
All right, OK, that is a headline. It's a newspaper headline, and it may not be a bonfire, but are you suggesting that the UK takes more risks? In some ways, that it abandons a bit of caution, because that's how you've described the way Brussels has done regulation when it comes to public health, food safety and the environment. Otherwise...
No, I'll give you 3 examples. So on GDPR, we argue that it's not working. Actually, it's big tech is getting away with all sorts of things, while community groups, village halls, parish councils are locked up in compliance and cookies and not being able to share memberships with each other. This is ridiculous. So we've suggested that the UK should set out our own data protection and privacy framework, rooted in a much stronger sense of consumer rights, patient rights, protection for the individual.
But what benefits will we see? I mean, what benefits will the ordinary person see?
Oh, huge benefits. So partly, firstly, growth. We've recommended a change to our pension rules. So you may be surprised to know that here in the UK, one of the reasons we don't keep our exciting new companies is that they can't raise money here, because our pension rules at the moment mean that we put 50% less than other countries into equities and into companies. So we've suggested that change.
All right.
On, say, nutraceuticals, functional foods, hugely exciting new area, from yogurts, I better not mention the brand names, from cholesterol-preventing yogurts to super veg that prevents heart disease. We, at the moment, don't regulate for them. You have to be a food or a medicine. We have nothing in between. So we've suggested the UK set out a framework for leading in this exciting new sector.
Aisha, listening to all of that, are you convinced? There was lots of talk about the freedoms that the UK would gain once we left the EU. Does this and what George has been talking about convince you?
Sadly not. I used to work at the Department of Trade and Industry as a press officer back in 2000, and ministers were always talking about wanting to cut red tape, and it never really happened. And when people do try to cut red tape, where that normally falls is, things like health and safety and workers' rights. So that will make a lot of people feel quite anxious. The other thing is, Brexit was meant to be this great liberation from red tape. But actually, it has turned into a fiesta of form-filling, paperwork and bureaucracy. We're seeing that with the Northern Irish Protocol. Lots of small businesses are really, really struggling with that as they try and export their goods. Even EU citizens are having to sort of reapply for their status. So I do find it quite ironic that there is this, admirable drive to cut red tape at the same time, while lots of people are drowning in red tape because of Brexit.
Yeah, well, that's true, isn't it, in terms of Northern Ireland? That's exactly what's happened.
Well,
more form-filling, more bureaucracy.
I mean, I voted Remain, but part of the reason I was so pleased to be invited by the PM to do this is it seems to me if we're going to leave the single market and all the easy access that came with it, we had better have a compensating benefit for the UK. And Aisha, I mean, it's really important as a former Minister for Life Science, I'm absolutely in no way wanting to compromise the very highest standards of our clinical research. But I'll give you a specific example. The EU Clinical Trials Directive was set up in order to make sure that in Lithuania and Latvia and across the 27 countries, there are basic standards. Great. But the UK is leading, as we've shown through the vaccine trial, leading in genomic trials, in informatics, in creating new ways of doing trials, and we're held back. And, I mean, there is no greater illustration than the UK COVID trial, the biggest in the world, of what we can do if we're freer to do it our way. And that will deliver huge benefits, more clinical trials all around the UK, access to new drugs for NHS patients, huge boost to our economy.
All right, I mean, Emily, they were instructed not to look at workplace regulation or deregulation. Is that right?
Well, no, I think that, there shouldn't be any sectors that we don't look at in terms of deregulation. If there's a reason to remove a regulation that isn't working, that is adding a burden that isn't sufficiently justified, then there should be, the government should be going through all the rules that we've inherited from the EU that, of course, we transferred once we left. So it really is up to the government now to look through all of those rules that we adopted, that we haven't got rid of, and decide which ones are a burden and which ones would we would be better off getting rid of. And I think that's a sensible thing to do. And of course, we've seen very visibly how outside the EU, as a free trading, a sovereign nation, we've been able to strike deals. It's very exciting, the deal with Australia, but we also have to take advantage of the domestic autonomy that we now have. We have inherited, as I said, so much regulation from the European Union. The government is right to be looking to review all of this and decide what benefits our economy and what doesn't. And I think it's a very good thing that we're looking at the precautionary principle, because this may have been one of the reasons why the EU decided to suspend the AstraZeneca vaccine. Just off the back of a few cases of blood clots. And that was probably a massive mistake now with hindsight, and was at the time. So I think, I think this is a good thing, and I think this is definitely will be one of the major benefits of having left the European Union, who has been so cautious over this pandemic.
Well, do you have any sympathy with what Emily has said, Andrew, that it's been too cautious? The EU, Brussels perhaps isn't the best place to draw up regulation, and we've been stymied by it in the past.
Well, no, I don't accept that, because we have had some great advances in this country because of us working together across the EU to set standards. I mean, I do take George's point that we have now left the European Union. One of the freedoms that we have as a sovereign country is to develop our own laws, our own rules, and our own regulations. And I trust George is a good chap to want the very best, to want to drive up standards. But what I don't trust is some of George's colleagues around the cabinet table, and I do fear that this will be a race to the bottom, and it will be ordinary people that lose out, and it will be British business in the end that loses out, not least because, we've just heard about the Australia deal. Now, George, I quite accept, wants the best environmental standards, the best food safety standards, but what we are seeing is in these trade deals, we're sacrificing those very same standards for a quick buck.
Well, I'm grateful for the compliment, but I can absolutely assure you, please read the report, because it's a lot of work. It's 120 recommendations, and we haven't touched any of those very important workers' rights, environmental undertakings that were fundamental. I voted for them, and they're in the agreement. What we've set out here is an ambition for the UK and specific ways we could really unleash global leadership in setting the standards in new sectors of growth. The EU will take decades to do it. We have a chance now to do it, and real benefit around the country. So I'll give you another example. We've developed here in my constituency a potato plant that doesn't need to be sprayed with 14 applications of toxic fungicide. It's resistant to blight. The EU banned it. Well, that is a huge, huge environmental advantage, cost advantage for UK farming. And on trade deals, we have an opportunity to start to use trade deals to export our technology for sustainable, green farming and agriculture.
As I say, George, I trust you on these things, but it's not you that's making the decisions, it's government ministers, and I just see this as deregulation, a race to the bottom, and I do fear that we will end with worse standards, not better standards. And the other thing, Joe, is that the United Kingdom, although it's free from the European Union and all of that because of Brexit, it isn't isolated from the European Union. We still want to trade with our European friends and partners. We've still got to, in many cases, meet the standards that Brussels sets through British laws.
And in here, we suggest not dropping standards, improving them, increasing them, so we lead. And the ambition in here is that Europe will look and say, those clever Brits, they've used their freedom not to race to the bottom, but to go to the top. They're now setting the standard in agri-environmental regulation. They're setting the standards in clinical trials, in digital health, and they will copy us.
And let's hope that British farmers feel the same when our Australian cousins start to adopt our food standards rather than impose theirs.
So we've dealt with that in here. We've set out a new framework for agri-environmental regulation in the UK. Most farmers here now have 200 regulations, 20 agencies, clipboards every year with visits. We've set out a proper framework so that people can invest in biodiversity net gain and support UK farmers developing best practice. Please read the report. It's a vision for leadership, not a race to the bottom.
I'm going to hand them all out to you at the end. A bit tricky with Emily and Aisha. Just finally, you want to say something, Aisha, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, I'm a great admirer of George, and I think he's pursuing a noble cause here, but you do have to look at the here and now. You cannot just ignore the concerns that British farmers and British environmentalists and people who do really care about food standards are flagging about the Australia deal. There's still lots we don't know about it, and it's going to be very, very difficult for British farmers to compete with that level of scale. I know you talk about trying to cut down on bureaucracy and red tape that they will face. Well, if the government does adopt any of your recommendations, it will take time for that to come through. Right now, British farmers are facing a real nightmare with the prospect of what's coming down the track. And also British consumers are really worried about food standards falling because of these trade deals. So I do think that's something, I think your aims are very admirable, but you do have to look at what's happening in the here and now.
So I have to respond. I have an agricultural constituency. Bear in mind, the Australian trade deals don't come in for 15 years. And in this report, we set out a model for consumer labelling so that British consumers can look at a piece of beef from Australia and a piece of beef from Scotland, and they can see whether the tractor is green or red. And if it's grown in the UK, low carbon footprint, high environmental standards, high quality, we think people will choose the higher quality product. So we're setting out a framework for investment in standards.
All right.
But what, just very quickly, a huge amount of distraction and time when we have people right on our doorstep. They have the same food standards as us. We're not going to be wasting and burning loads of carbon and, importing their products. Again, it just kind of highlights a lot of real inconsistencies.
All right. Well, you mentioned the environment, and a new report, government advisers have said that the UK is woefully unprepared to deal with changes happening to the climate. We're going to come to that in just a moment because we have some breaking news. Let's go into the newsroom here in Westminster and talk to the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young. Tell us what's going on.
So Dominic Cummings, the former chief advisor to the Prime Minister, who you will remember when he gave evidence to Select Committee about the lessons learned from the COVID pandemic, has responded to the evidence given by Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary. Now, you'll remember that he was incredibly critical of Matt Hancock, and this very long blog continues in that vein. He says that the new testing plan was forced on Matt Hancock by Number 10. He says that community testing was stopped momentarily, and he accuses Matt Hancock of focusing on the media and himself and then lying. Now, you'll remember Matt Hancock, to that Select Committee of MPs, denied ever lying to the Prime Minister about any of these issues. And then Matt Hancock Dominic Cummings goes on to show a private WhatsApp message between himself and the Prime Minister. Now, in it, he talks about the huge escalation in the number of tests that America were doing, saying they went from 2,200 tests a fortnight ago to the 27,000. This is on the 27th of March last year. And he goes on to say that this is what should be done here in this country. And then in response to this text message, you can see a response from Dominic Cummings in which he said, a response from the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, in which he says totally hopeless, although there is an expletive in the middle of that, which we won't go into on air. Dominic Cummings accuses Matt Hancock of incompetence and dishonesty. He says that he's creating a new version of reality of what actually happened. Talks about COVID patients being sent from hospitals untested into care homes, and then talks more relevantly now about the Delta variant. He says the border policy is a joke, and he says that there's a systemic incompetence surrounding the Prime Minister, which something must be done about. But he says that nothing will be done if the Conservatives remain ahead in the polls.
Vicky, thank you very much. You're going to be joining us after Prime Minister's questions, and we will look at this once again in more detail. But, George, let me just get your reaction. This is serious, isn't it? Because here we have the private messages between the Prime Minister and his former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, and it, in fact, reveals, it seems, from what we have just shown our viewers in that response, about what they thought of Matt Hancock.
I think the reliability of Dominic Cummings' evidence is deeply questionable.
But these are private texts, aren't they?
Well, I haven't seen them, and I think Dominic Cummings is, certainly in the eyes of my constituents, he looks like somebody who has been fired and is now angry and trying to blame everyone else. He seems to be saying that everyone was an idiot apart from him, but he was, of course, in control. He was the Prime Minister's chief advisor during this period. It's really not good enough to now come out and attack everyone else. Of course, mistakes will have been made, and that's why the government's rightly committed to a proper and full inquiry. And there are lessons still to be learnt. I think this is incredibly unhelpful at a time when we're trying to control a pandemic, build public trust and confidence in vaccination. And I think most people look at Matt Hancock and say he's unbelievably energetic, committed. The vaccination programme has been a triumph.
But it's important he tells the truth.
Of course, and I'm very, very surprised that Dominic Cummings is making these accusations. I haven't seen the text. The Prime Minister may well be saying that the UK response is not good enough.
All right.
That's very different to accusing one of his cabinet ministers of lying, which I just find it impossible to believe. And I think Dominic Cummings is causing mischief for his own reasons.
All right, we'll come back to that later on. But let's return to what we started off with before we spoke to Vicky, which is about climate change and how prepared the UK is. According to a climate change committee, it's woefully unprepared to deal with the changes that are already happening. Let's talk to our energy and environment analyst, Roger Harrabin. Roger, what do they recommend we do to climate-proof our homes?
Well, it's more than just homes. I mean, this is a huge report, including new science and moving into policy. And the science concludes that at the moment the UK government is supposed to be preparing the country for the eventuality of a 2-degree rise in temperature above pre-industrial levels. The new science, according to the committee, says it needs to be preparing for a 4 Celsius rise. Not that we will definitely get it, but that we will need to prepare for it. And the committee looks back at the previous actions that the government has taken to climate-proof the economy, if you like. And although the government has been way ahead as a world leader in terms of setting out targets for cutting emissions, the committee says its performance has been shocking. That's a word they use, shocking, in terms of actually climate-proofing the UK for the problems that we'd be likely to face. And you mentioned homes, for instance. I mean, they are very angry that since the time of the last report from the committee 5 years ago, nothing has been done, they say, to make homes more heat-proof, because we're going to be having lots more heat waves and more serious heat waves. And it warns that people in homes and indeed particularly in flats are going to really suffer with the levels of heat we're going to be seeing over the next 10, 20 years, particularly in big cities.
Andrew?
Well, this is incredibly concerning, isn't it? We know that climate change is happening. I think there is cross-party consensus in Parliament that we absolutely have to do everything we can to prepare for this. But the onus is on the government to deliver. And what this report is suggesting is that not only aren't we delivering, we're actually falling further behind. So if anything is a wake-up call for the government, for ministers, and I would support them in turbocharging this, getting the preparations for the inevitable rises in climate across the world, but also to use our leadership, because we are the president of the COP26 this year. We don't just need to lead by example. We need to also ensure that other countries do the same. And that's not happening either.
I want to just stick with how people might have to adapt their homes, as Roger was saying, to make them more heat-proof for the future. And this report saying that we're way behind. Emily, you heard Andrew saying there that this is very much the government's responsibility. What do you think the division should be, if any, between government and individuals?
I think the fact that we're falling behind, or as the report says, I think this might reflect the fact that it's very easy for the government to set lofty aims and to put into legislation, commitments to net zero by 2050 and to slash emissions by 78% by 2035, I think is what we're committed to. But it's another thing to sort of implement these changes. We've already picked the low-hanging fruit when it comes to decarbonising our power system. That was the easy stuff. Now it's going to be huge changes for people and for people and their individual lives, whether it's prohibitions on how they can travel, whether, as you say, whether it's big changes to the way they heat their homes or bring in different efficiency devices and so on. These are big changes in how people are going to live their life, whether they're allowed to go on holiday or so on. And I think the government desperately needs to be honest, otherwise people aren't going to go along with it. Because you have to remember that there's been no democratic mandate really for these net zero targets. So, the government is going to have to take the country along with it, and it's not going to do so if it isn't honest with them.
George?
No democratic mandate. We won the biggest majority for nearly, 70 years. There's a huge mandate for it.
Yeah,
Emily.
but hang on. But have you been honest with people about what they might actually have to do?
Right, let me come to that. So we've led the world, and Roger made clear, world-class leadership on energy. And you're right that now the challenge is, if we're really going to deliver a net zero economy and lead the world, then housing, transport, agriculture become absolutely key. I used to be Minister for Decarbonisation at Transport, but the public opinion is moving. More and more people want now to have a little bit of active travel in their day, to be able to walk to the tube or to the bus stop. I think attitudes are changing. I do worry, certainly in my part of the world, we're still building huge housing estates by the big volume house builders based on 1960s technology. It's bricks and boilers. And why the big companies like Persimmon and others, who are being paid a lot of money to build these homes, why they're not leading in green housing, I think, is a real problem. And we've got to get onto this fast. And we've got to stop building huge commuter housing estates with 3-car commuting. That is not going to get us to net zero. We need to put bike lanes in, give people healthy living and active choices. And I think the public are with us.
Right.
No one wants to sit in a traffic jam in a car pumping out diesel fumes. People want to live healthy lives.
Right, PMQs, Prime Minister's questions coming up in a few moments' time. There is the chamber beginning to fill up as much as it can. Aisha, yes, I mean, some of those things are no doubt true that George has been saying. But when it comes to the hard, cold facts about the adaptations you might have to make to your home, one of the suggestions is shutters on the outside. You've got to better ventilate indoors. If you're living in a high-rise flat, that's not going to be very easy at all. And we already know that numbers of heat-related deaths are already quite high. So, I mean, how are people going to manage those adaptations that are going to be forced on them?
Well, if anybody follows me on my Twitter feed, they will know that I am literally dying of the heat in this weather. It's my Scottish ancestry or origins, which, I mean, I find the heat in the city absolutely unbearable. And I joke about it, but it is actually very serious. As you say, older people really struggle, pregnant women really struggle in this heat. We're not geared up for the heat, and that is something which we're going to have to do. I mean, I have shutters. I've opened them because we're recording. I keep my shutters shut most of the time to try and keep the heat out. I mean, I live like a vampire, basically.
I didn't want to say that.
I literally live like a vampire. But it's a serious issue, and it is one, like we've started to have a conversation about making your house more energy efficient, but we aren't really having a proper conversation about how to cope with this very, very hot weather as well. So we need to have far more.
I'm going to have to stop you there in your shuttered home because it's Prime Minister's questions. Thank you.
And I'm sure those of the whole House are with her family and friends. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the House will wish to join me in offering our thanks and best wishes to Sir Roy Stone, who is leaving the Government Chief Whip's office and the Civil Service. He's worked for 13 Chief Whips and for over 20 years has played an invaluable role in delivering the Government of the Day's legislative programme. We wish him well. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure we would all wish to associate ourselves with the Prime Minister's remarks in relation both to Jo Cox and Roy Stone. The Prime Minister, I know, will report later to the House in more detail on the G7 summit, which I know President Biden described as extremely collaborative and successful. In taking forward the agenda, and in particular that part of the agenda of the summit, which calls for us to work to uphold the rule of law and respect for an international rules-based system, will he bear in mind and task all parts of government to promote the great asset that we have in English common law and in the expertise and reputation for integrity of our judiciary and legal systems? Will he make sure that those willing assets are harnessed in the pursuit of that G7 agenda, be it through writing commercial contracts with English law as a jurisdiction or helping through our expertise developing countries and markets?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his question. He raises a very important and vital sector of our economy, our legal services industry, and our judicial system, which is admired around the world. One of the reasons that we're capable of attracting so much inward investment into this country, Mr. Speaker, but also one of the key exports, Mr. Speaker, that we've been able to promote just recently, thanks, for instance, to our free trade deal with Australia.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join with the Prime Minister's remarks in relation to Sir Roy Stone? This week also marks the 4th anniversary of the Grenfell fire tragedy, where 72 people lost their lives. It's frankly an outrage that there are still more than 200 high-rise flats with Grenfell-style cladding, and many leaseholders are trapped in homes that are neither safe nor sellable. The best way to mark this tragedy is not with words, but with action, and I urge the Prime Minister finally to end the cladding scandal. Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister has already said, today is the 5th anniversary of the death of our dear friend and colleague Jo Cox. Jo had already changed so many lives for the better. She was passionate about creating a fairer, more just world. I know she would have gone on to achieve so much more, and that she would have been so proud of the work of her foundation and what it's doing in her name. Jo and I were in the same intake into this House. We were friends and our children are around the same age. And there's not a day that goes by when we don't miss Jo. And I know I speak not just for these benches, but for many across the House, when I say that today we remember Joe. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister recognise that his decision to keep our borders open contributed to the spread of the Delta variant in this country?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker. I think that Captain Hindsight needs to adjust his retro spectroscope because he's completely wrong. We put India on the red list, Mr. Speaker, on April the 23rd, and the Delta variant was not so identified until April the 28th, Mr. Speaker, and was only identified as a variant of concern on May the 7th. Mr. Speaker, when he criticises this government for wanting to keep our borders open, just remember that he voted 43 times in the last 5 years, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that our border controls were kept in the hands of Brussels, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, this is absurd. I have, on 7 occasions at PMQs, raised the question of the borders with the Prime Minister. They're all marked up in the transcript. They're all there in Hansard, Prime Minister. Time for a better defence. Your defence is as bad as your border policy. And Mr. Speaker, this is the Prime Minister talks about the dates. Let's go through the dates. On March the 24th, a new variant was reported in India. On the 1st of April, India was reporting that over 100,000 new infections were rising a day and rising. But the Prime Minister kept India off the red list until the 23rd of April. In that time, 20,000 people came into the UK from India. What on earth did the Prime Minister expect would be the consequences of that? The British people did their bit by following the rules and getting vaccinated, but the Prime Minister squandered it by letting a new variant into the country. That was not inevitable. It was the consequence of his indecision. If the Prime Minister disagrees with me, and he answered the first question no, what is his explanation as to why Britain has such high rates of the Delta variation? What's his explanation?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there's a very simple reason why the UK generally has a better understanding of the variants in this country, and that's because we do 47% of the genomic testing anywhere in the world, Mr. Speaker. And I really think that he should get his facts straight, because the Delta variant, as I've said, was identified in this country on April the 28th. And I have a document on which I believe the Leader of the Opposition is relying, Mr. Speaker, in which he says that the Delta variant, it seems to be published by someone called David Evans, General Secretary of the Labour Party, saying that the Delta variant was identified on April the 1st, Mr. Speaker. He says B1617 was designated under investigation on April the 1st, the Delta variant. Mr. Speaker, that is not the Delta variant. That is the Kappa variant, Mr. Speaker. It's a Gamma, Mr. Speaker, for the Labour Party. There's a difference. The Delta variant, as it happens, is seeded around the world in 74 countries and sadly is growing. But there's a difference between those countries and this country, Mr. Speaker. In this country, we vaccinated almost 79% of the adult population and given 2 vaccinations to 56%, a programme that he would have stopped, Mr. Speaker, by keeping us in the European Medicines Agency.
Keir Starmer.
The question was, what's his explanation for our high rates of the Delta variant? Answer, there came none, other than apparently we understand the variant. The data is very, very clear. Our NHS has been doing an amazing job with the vaccine rollout. But while the NHS was vaccinating, he was vacillating. It's because of his indecision that our borders stayed open. It's because of his indecision that India stayed off the red list. It's because of his indecision that in that period 20,000 people came to this country from India. Mr. Speaker, the consequences are now clear. The rate of the Delta variant is much higher here than in other countries. And we learned today that, tragically, once again, the UK has the highest infection rate in Europe. We did not want to top that table again. Mr. Speaker, if his borders policy is so strong, how does the Prime Minister explain that?
Mr. Speaker, I think for the ease of the House, he should begin by pulping his document in which he incorrectly identifies what the Delta variant is. Mr. Speaker, we took the most drastic steps possible to put India on the red list on April the 23rd, before that variant was even identified. And the big difference between this country and the rest of Europe, he loves these comparisons, Mr. Speaker, it shows his instincts, but the big difference is that we've had the fastest vaccine rollout anywhere in Europe. We have a very, very high degree of protection, and it's thanks to the vaccine rollout, thanks to the fantastic efforts of the NHS, that we have now, and we can continue, with one of the most open economies and societies in Europe, and get on with our cautious but irreversible roadmap to freedom, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister put as much effort into protecting our borders as he does coming up with ridiculous excuses, the country would be reopening next week. But even now, what do we know? The Delta variant is responsible for 90% of infections in this country. He's persisting with a traffic light system that doesn't work and won't stop other variants coming in. Mr. Speaker, after so many mistakes and with the stakes so high, why doesn't the Prime Minister do what Labour is calling for? Drop the traffic light system, get rid of the amber list, secure the borders and do everything possible to save the British summer.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he doesn't even know what the Delta variant is, we have the toughest border measures anywhere in the world, and we will continue. We have 50 countries on the red list, Mr. Speaker. And if he's now saying that he wants to stop all transit, all traffic, all travel to and from this country, then it's yet another flip-flop from the Labour leader of the opposition. Yet another totally unintelligible flip-flop, Mr. Speaker. If he wants to close this country down to travel, which is what I understood him to be saying, then it's not only yet another flip-flop, but it's also totally pointless, because we have 75% of our medicines and 50% of our food that comes in from abroad, Mr. Speaker. He's got to adopt a consistent position.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, what I've learned, the worse the position for the Prime Minister, the more pathetic he gets. Is he really suggesting that the 20,000 people who came in from India were bringing in vital medical supplies or food? It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. What we were arguing for is for India to be on the red list between the 1st and the 23rd of April. If that had happened, we wouldn't have the Delta variant here. And it's as simple as that. The Prime Minister's former senior adviser got it absolutely right. He said, and I quote, fundamentally there was no proper border policy because the Prime Minister never wanted a proper border policy. The man who was in the room. And it's those in hospitality, in clubs, in pubs, the arts, tourism and travel who are paying the price of the Prime Minister's failure. All they ask is that if they have to keep their businesses closed, they get the support that they need. But where is it? Business rate relief is being withdrawn from the end of this month, affecting 750,000 businesses. Furlough is being phased out. Mr. Speaker, in Wales, the Labour government has acted by extending business rate relief for a year and providing new support for those affected. When is the Prime Minister going to do the same for businesses in England?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're proud of the support we've given to businesses up and down the country, and the whole point about the cautious approach that we are taking is to continue support both with furlough and with support through business rates, through grants of up to £18,000, the support from councils. All of that is continuing. But what we're also seeing is we're seeing businesses slowly recovering, and the growth in the economy in April was 2.3%. Card spending over the bank holiday weekend was actually 20% above pre-pandemic levels, Mr. Speaker. I know how tough things have been, and we will look after business throughout this pandemic. But thanks to the vaccine rollout, thanks to the cautious steps we are taking, we are seeing a shot in the arm for business across the country, and we will look after them all the way.
Keir Starmer.
Speaker, yet again, it's not what the government has done, it's what's needed now in light of the decision that was taken this week. Hospitality UK says the sector will lose £3 billion because of the delay and that 200,000 jobs could be at risk. That's not what has been done, it's what's needed now, Prime Minister. And the Federation of Small Businesses warns the government is being dangerously complacent. I think we've just seen an example of that. Mr. Speaker, we all want these restrictions to be over, for our economy to be open, for businesses to thrive. But the Prime Minister's indecision at the borders has blown it. And the problem with everything the Prime Minister says today, both what he says at dispatch box and also what he mutters, is that we've heard it all before so many times. Last month, March, he said we could turn the tide in 12 weeks. Remember that? Then he said it will all be over by Christmas. Then we were told June 21st would be Freedom Day. Now we're told July 19th is Terminus Day. The British people don't expect miracles, but they do expect basic competence and honesty. And when it comes to care homes, protective equipment or borders, we see the same pattern from this Prime Minister. Too slow, too indecisive, over-promising, under-delivering. After all these failures and mistakes, why should anyone believe the Prime Minister now?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, why should anybody believe the leader of the opposition when he can't decide what he thinks from one week to the next? He says he has a tough position on borders. Actually, he was attacking quarantine only recently and saying that it was a blunt instrument that should be lessened, Mr. Speaker. What I think the people of this country want to see is a government getting on with the vaccine rollout and getting on with our cautiously irreversible roadmap to freedom. And I'm very pleased, and he should say it again, that we have one of the fastest vaccine rollouts anywhere in the world, certainly the fastest in Europe. It would not have been possible if we'd stayed in the EMA. We would not have been able to control our borders if, as he voted for 43 times, Mr. Speaker, we'd stayed in the EU. We're getting on with the job. We're bringing forward now 23, 24-year-olds for asking them to come forward for their vaccines. I ask everybody to come forward for their second jab. I trust he has had his, Mr. Speaker, and we are delivering on our commitments to the British people. Not only a great outcome at the G7 summit this last weekend in Carbis Bay, but a new free trade agreement with Australia and building back better across our country. We're getting on with the job, Mr. Speaker, and it would be a wonderful thing once in his time as leader of the opposition to hear some support for what the government is doing and some backing up for our approach.
Bob Bristow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, doctors and care settings issued an unprecedented number of do not resuscitate orders to patients with learning disabilities and mental illness. Many were unlawful and caused avoidable deaths. Despite urgent CQC and NHS guidance, shockingly, this practice has continued. Last week, The Telegraph reported that Sonia De Leon died unresuscitated. Her family said she was given a DNR without them knowing, and with her learning disabilities and schizophrenia stated as reasons. Does the Prime Minister share my alarm about these cases, which should have no place in our care, and does he agree that they should be independently investigated?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this very sad case with me, and I'm sure the whole House will be thinking of Sonia De Leon and her family. I think that such decisions on do not attempt, do not resuscitate, should be made only in accordance with a decision involving the person concerned and their carers and their families, Mr. Speaker.
We now come to the SNP leader, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks that you made, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and the absolutely brutal death of our friend and colleague Jo Cox 5 years ago, a woman that was dedicated to public service, that made in her short time here a tremendous contribution to this House, and our thoughts are very much with her family, her friends and all those that care very deeply for her loss. And of course, as we do that, we should also reflect on what we saw earlier this week with the journalist Nick Watt chased through the streets of Whitehall by a mob seeking to intimidate. And we must all stand up in this House for the rights of journalists to be able to go around their work safely. I say, Mr. Speaker, good wishes both to Scotland and England ahead of the football match on Friday evening. But if I may say so, I do hope that we don't see Scotland being dragged out of the Euros against our wishes at the end of the week. Mr. Speaker, as we enter the chamber, we see what is reported to be WhatsApp communication between the Prime Minister and Dominic Cummings, and perhaps the Prime Minister will clarify whether or not these are genuine and whether the derogatory comments that he expressed on his Health Secretary are valid or not. Mr. Speaker, this morning, the details of the disastrous trade deal with Australia are slowly seeping out. It tells us everything that we need to know, that these details are being celebrated in Canberra, but they're busy being concealed in London. For all the spin, it's clear that this Tory government has just thrown Scottish farmers and crofters under their Brexit bus, just as they sold out our fishing communities. So today, those with most to lose from this deal don't need to hear the Prime Minister's usual waffle. Their livelihoods are at stake, Prime Minister. Just this once, they deserve honest answers from this government. Can the Prime Minister confirm that from day one of this deal, 35,000 tonnes of Australian beef and 25,000 tonnes of Australian lamb will be free to flood the UK market tariff-free?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is a great deal for the UK, it's a great deal for Scotland, it's a great deal for Scottish whisky, it's a great deal for Scottish business and services exports, it's a great deal for Scottish legal services, but it's also a great deal for Scottish farming. And how tragic, how absolutely tragic that it should be the posture of the Scottish National Party, Mr. Speaker, to see absolutely no way in which Scottish farmers could be able to take advantage of the opportunity to export around the world. What he doesn't realise is there already are £350 million worth of UK food going from this country to Australia. This is an opportunity to turbocharge those exports, to get behind Scottish farming and encourage them, Mr. Speaker, not run them down.
Ian Blackford.
My goodness, I don't even think the Prime Minister can believe that tripe. Mr. Speaker, in the Tories' desperation to get a post-Brexit trade deal with somebody, with anybody, they've given the farm away, literally. It is blindingly obvious who the winners and who are the losers in this deal. Australia's economy will benefit to the tune of $1.3 billion a year. The UK government's own assessment says that the Australian deal is worth just, and I quote, 0.02% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, you would need 200 Australian deals to come close to mitigating the cost of Brexit. We were told that Brexit was all about taking back control. But for our farmers and for our crofters, there's been no scrutiny, there's been no consultation, and there's been no consent. So if the Prime Minister is really confident about the benefits of this deal, does he have the guts to put it to a vote in this House?
Mr. Speaker, the people of this country voted for this government to get on and deliver free trade deals around the world. And I believe they were totally right. He talks about tripe, Mr. Speaker. Well, I can tell him that when it comes to exporting the intestines of sheep, which I know is a valuable part of Scottish tradition, even that is now being opened up around the world thanks to the deals that this country is doing. And Mr. Speaker, if he is saying that he wants to go back into the EU, hand back control of our fisheries, hand back control of our agriculture to Brussels, lose all the opportunities that this country has gained, I think he is frankly out of his mind and going in totally the wrong direction. And if he means a referendum, another referendum, Mr. Speaker, we had one of those.
Can I just say gently to everybody, we now need to turbocharge questions and answers. Ola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to our unique geography, the High Peak has some of the worst broadband and mobile coverage gaps anywhere in the country. We are making good progress, but can I urge the Prime Minister to redouble efforts in the rollout of ultra-fast broadband, especially to hard-to-reach rural areas like the High Peak? And can I suggest that the government builds on the success of the Kickstart scheme with more focused support for key infrastructure industries so that we can recruit a new generation of highly skilled broadband engineers to turbocharge the rollout?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, he's absolutely right, and that's why we're working with industry to accelerate our rural network, and coverage across the whole of the UK has massively increased and will be increasing thanks to the steps that we're taking.
Sir Geoffrey Dawes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know, like me, the Prime Minister cares passionately about the Union. Can the Prime Minister therefore confirm that the passing of the EU Withdrawal Act and the Northern Ireland Protocol that forms part of it has not resulted in an implied repeal of Article 6 of the Act of Union, which enables Northern Ireland to trade freely with the rest of this United Kingdom? And will he commit to fully restoring Northern Ireland's place within the UK internal market?
Prime Minister.
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. I can give assurances on both those counts, and I can say that unless we see progress on the implementation of the protocol, which I think is currently totally disproportionate, then we will have to take the necessary steps to do exactly what he says.
Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the rebuild of Hillingdon Hospital will be a great benefit to his constituents and mine? And will he commit to working with me and other local members of Parliament and potential future MPs like Peter Fleet and Chesham and Amersham to secure the future of services at Hillingdon's other site, Mount Vernon, in my constituency, which provides specialist medical treatments to a very wide catchment area?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend. He's totally right about Hillingdon Hospital, which has a great future, and we will make sure, and I look forward to working with him and to make sure that the future of services at Mount Vernon is also protected, and I know that a full consultation is due to start in September.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kevin, a hotel manager in Oxford, contacted me last week because he's worried. Because even if this country does open up in the next few weeks, he won't be able to run at full capacity due to chronic staff shortages. Local staff are leaving the industry because of the uncertainty caused by this government's bungled handling of this pandemic. The EU staff have already left because of the botched handling of Brexit, and he can't recruit from abroad because of the damaging new immigration policy. This is the Prime Minister's wake-up call. Oxfordshire's economy alone relies on the hospitality industry to the tune of £2.5 billion. Will the government introduce a COVID recovery visa to help Kevin recruit the staff he desperately needs?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely true that as we open up our economy, there are more vacancies, and that's great. But we also have large numbers of people in this country, Mr. Speaker, large numbers of young people who need jobs, and large numbers of people who are still furloughed. And I think what we want to see is those people coming forward to get those jobs. But of course, we will retain an open and a flexible approach towards allowing talent to come in from overseas.
Anthony Mac.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows the full value of the UK shellfish industry and the opportunity potential that there is. This week, the Food Standards Agency produced a list of recommendations that will allow us to regrade our waters, challenge anomalous results. However, those recommendations only come in September this year. Will the Prime Minister flex his muscles and see if the report and the recommendation can be brought forward to the end of this month?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will do everything I can to ensure that we accelerate this process. He's right to raise it. A great deal of progress has already been made, and the Food Standards Agency has, I think, been flexible, but we need to go further, and we'll make sure that great British shellfish can continue to be exported to Europe and around the world.
Maureen Fellows.
The UK government's trade deal with Australia has been made with no consultation, no consent and no parliamentary scrutiny. The President of the National Farmers Union of Scotland has said our seafood industry has already been hit hard by Brexit, and now Scottish farming will be sacrificed. Again, it's Scotland's key industries which will bear the brunt of a Tory Brexit people in Scotland did not vote for. Does the Prime Minister think these concerns from NFU Scotland President, and does he accept them, or does he think that he knows better?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you would think from listening to the SNP that there was no Scotch whisky industry or no banking and financial services industries in Scotland. But even then, they're missing the point, because this is a massive opportunity for the Scottish agriculture sector. And what they need is a different type of MP, Mr. Speaker, who can champion them, who can get behind them, who actually believes in Scotland, Mr. Speaker. That's what the people of Scotland need.
Philip Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the reasons for the popularity of the Prime Minister is that he's always been on the side of the public rather than on the side of the establishment. Given that overall deaths in the UK over the last 13 weeks are 8,873 below the 5-year average, which includes the time the Indian variant has been around, can my right honourable friend explain why, instead of trusting his world-leading vaccine programme, the common sense of the British people and his conservative instincts of individual freedom and individual responsibility, he instead prefers to trust people like Professor Susan Mickey at Sage, a long-standing member of the Communist Party, who last week let the cat out of the bag and said she wanted some COVID restrictions to last forever?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, nobody, least of all I or my honourable friend, want to see COVID restrictions last forever, nor do I think that they are going to last forever, Mr. Speaker. As I made clear earlier this week, I think we can have a high degree of confidence that our vaccination programme will work, and I think we need to give it a little bit more time, as I've explained, to save many thousands more lives by vaccinating millions more people. That's what we want to do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Ross has been invited to sit his driving theory test in Oban, 100 miles away from his home in Hamilton. His test has already been cancelled twice, first in November last year and then February 2021. This September, Ross is starting a university course in paramedic science with a view to becoming a qualified paramedic in the Scottish Ambulance Service with placements across Scotland. Being able to drive is crucial. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss the delays in the scheduling of DVSA theory tests and the impracticality of the locations being offered?
Yes. Prime Minister. I thank the honourable lady. I am aware of the problem, and we're doing what we can to accelerate the number of driving instructors and testers, so to allow young people such as the gentleman she mentions to get their driving test done and enable them to fulfil their ambitions.
Mr. Speaker, I support the Prime Minister's comments on Joe Cox, and also, as a former Chief Whip, his comment on Sir Roy Stone. Sir Roy gave amazing service to me as Chief Whip during the worst of the Brexit years in dealing with the hung Parliament and with the odd occasional disruptive backbencher. Mr. Speaker, Northern Ireland faces some challenges over the coming weeks in terms of nominating a First and Deputy First Minister. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that it's vital that parties stick to the agreements that have been made, the New Decade New Approach, which he and I negotiated 18 months ago, and that in failing to do that, we ultimately, and I know he doesn't like this concept, that the UK government does act as a backstop?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to thank my right honourable friend for all the work that he did in the New Decade New Approach deal, and I do agree that it will be a good thing for the whole package to be agreed, and I certainly support the approach that he set out. And I think that what the people in Northern Ireland want is a stable, functioning and mature executive.
Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A new Lord Advocate is taking up a position, but the structural flaws in the office remain. In no other legal jurisdiction in the UK, or indeed in the Western world, is the government senior legal advisor simultaneously the country's chief prosecutor. Yet the role is enshrined in the Scotland Act 1988. Will the Prime Minister commit to changes so that this historical anachronism can be changed and a separation of powers be achieved?
Prime Minister.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the honourable gentleman on the outstanding success of his party in the recent elections. But I will study the anomaly that he raises and revert to him as soon as possible.
Ruth Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the publication of the Tigger report today, published by my right honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford Green, my right honourable friend for Chipping Barnet and my honourable friend for Mid-Norfolk. The report makes recommendations about how to seize new opportunities from Brexit and back start-ups and new tech. Will my right honourable friend look closely at that report so that we can make the most of the great benefits of Brexit and lead the world in the development of new technologies?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable and right honourable friends for their excellent report, and I think it's time to put a Tigger in the tank.
Ellen Days.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks concerning the 5th anniversary of the murder of Jo Cox? Jo was a dear personal friend and colleague who will always be missed and remembered, and whose extraordinary legacy endures far beyond this place. Mr. Speaker, last month, a fire in an East London block of flats caused 3 people to be hospitalised and dozens more to be treated for smoke inhalation. That block was one of more than 200 high-rise buildings in England, still fitted with Grenfell-style cladding. I asked the Prime Minister, why is it that 4 years after the Grenfell tragedy took 72 lives, after all the warnings, all the tireless campaigning and the unspeakable injustice, people are still living in unsafe flats, and his government has failed to end the cladding scandal?
Mr. Speaker, we have invested massively in removing cladding from high-rise blocks. We'll continue to do so. I know the structure in question, the Ballymore, the company concerned, I do believe are too slow, and we are on their case, Mr. Speaker. But I think it is very, very important, very important, that people understand that overall risks of death by fire have been coming down for a very long time and will continue to come down. And it is simply not the case that all the high-rise buildings in this country are unsafe. And it's very important that members of Parliament should stress that.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Independent lifeboat stations like the Hamble Lifeboat in my constituency respond to over 100 incidents a year in the Solent. The pandemic has increased the operating costs of independent lifeboat stations while also restricting their ability to raise money. Will the Prime Minister look to see what more the government can do to support independent lifeboat stations like the Hamble Lifeboat as they keep a watchful eye on all of us?
Yes. Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for raising the excellent work of Hamble Lifeboats, and in April last year, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, put forward another £750 million in support of charities such as the one he mentions.
Stuart Malcolm.
Mr. Speaker, at 2 venues in Glasgow, hospitality venues called Blue Dog and Adlib, staff there have had no furlough payments since the summer of last year. Having raised this with HMRC directly, the situation still hasn't moved forward. If I send him the details, will he knock heads together, help the staff whose bills are going unpaid and debts are rising, and get the cash into their accounts they're entitled to?
Very happy to look at it, Mr. Speaker.
Liam Legg.
When can we expect the coordinated chorus of SAGE members recommencing their media appearances to depress morale? And does my right honourable friend fear having to give another press conference at which he again postpones the return of our freedoms? Mr. Speaker, we are rightly told that we need to learn to live with COVID. So what can the Prime Minister say to the country to convince us of that reality?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that academic and scientific freedom are an invaluable part of our country, and I also note that my scientific colleagues would echo my sentiments that we need to learn to live with COVID, Mr. Speaker.
Steve Macklin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's 2-child cap and its childcare proof of payment rules mean my hard-working constituent, Miss Cowan, who's a single parent on universal credit supporting 4 kids, faces £1,000 of nursery arrears. She's therefore at risk of losing their nursery places. She would therefore have to give up work and would therefore be at risk of sanction and forced further into debt and poverty. Can the Prime Minister help my constituent out of this trap, and will he fix these rules that are pushing people out of work and into poverty?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be happy to study the case, but the whole point of universal credit, which this government introduces, it's helping hundreds of thousands of people into work, and that is its success.
Jason McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I associate myself with the comments of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition about our friend Jo Cox. Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating rugby league legend Kevin Sinfield for his OBE in the Queen's birthday honours? Kevin has done so much to raise awareness of motor neurone disease and support his good friend Rob Burrow. MND is a devastating disease. There's no cure, but scientists, Mr. Speaker, believe they're on the cusp of developing effective treatments. So will the government please commit to investing £50 million over 5 years to establish a virtual MND research institute and accelerate research.
Prime Minister, totally agree with that. It should have been enacted. Come on then.
Right, thank you. And it's an OBE, Mr. Speaker. I also thank Kevin Fitzgerald very much for his outstanding work, and we're following it up with we're spending £55 million on research into MND, but there will be more to come as part of our general massive investment in life sciences.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The trade deal the Prime Minister has struck, simply put, means undercutting our farmers, shortchanging consumers, and it will set animal welfare standards back by decades. The RSPCA have said that the Prime Minister's deal will, and I quote, start a race to the bottom, and the losers will be billions of farmed animals and UK farmers. Does the Prime Minister accept these concerns from the experts at the RSPCA, or does he think that he knows better?
Prime Minister.
I really think that these constant attacks on Australia and their standards and their animal welfare standards would be very, very much resented by the people of Australia, and would not be recognised. Actually, Australia is marked 5 out of 5, which is the highest possible, by the World Organisation of Animal Health Performance and Veterinary Services Evaluation Team for Animal Welfare. And this deal, Mr. Speaker, that we've done is the first ever to incorporate high animal welfare standards as part of the package that Australia has agreed.
Lucy Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying...
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions there. There are a few more questions to go. You can watch it on BBC Parliament if you want to see it right through to the end. But let me introduce our guests for this part of the programme. Paul Scully, a business minister, and Luke Pollard, the Shadow Environment Secretary. Welcome to both of you. And the BBC's Deputy Political Editor is back with us, Vicky Young. First of all, Vicky, the questions, perhaps unsurprisingly, were on the government's border policy from Keir Starmer to Boris Johnson, particularly around when India was put onto the red list of countries, which means people have to quarantine in a hotel for a certain amount of time. Did we learn anything new?
Not really. I mean, we have heard these arguments before, and what the Labour leader is saying is that this is a pattern of behaviour from Boris Johnson. He says because he's too slow, he's too indecisive, he overpromises, and that's what leads to the problem. Now, his argument is that because we have so many cases which are the Delta variant, which first originated in India, that shows that it was a mistake to keep the border open, not to put India on the red list. He said it allowed 20,000 people to come into this country from India. And he says that's the reason. Now, the PM's response to that is that this country does an awful lot of genomic testing. That's the testing that works out which variant is which. And he says that's why we have so many. And he said that actually the Delta variant is unfortunately in 74 countries. And then he's returning once again, of course, to what he sees as a very strong card, which is the vaccination programme, and says because we've now given 2 jabs to 56% of the adult population, that does put us in a good position, because even though this is a new variant, the Delta one, actually the vaccinations are working very well against it.
Right, we're going to return to some of that in just a moment, because the elephant in the room during Prime Minister's questions, we talked to you about it, Vicky, just before we went into the Commons, is a blog that has been published by Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's former chief advisor, who left Downing Street in December last year. And it has revealed, rather devastatingly, direct messages between Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister. Now, we did show briefly this one. I'm going to show it to our viewers again and read it for our guests down the line. And you can see here, this is Dominic Cummings responding to what Matt Hancock said when he was defending himself about the allegations that we'd heard from Dominic Cummings before. Evidence on the COVID disaster. As the Prime Minister said himself, Hancock's performance on testing, procurement, PPE, care homes, etc. was totally, and then there's an expletive which is blanked out, hopeless, and his account to MPs was fiction. Now, there is and are various messages you can see here. This one is actually from Boris Johnson. It's a screen grab of one of those direct messages. It starts with dunno, and then it says, it's Hancock, says the Prime Minister. He has been hopeless. Let me just show you another one. Now, this is Boris Johnson on the 27th of April last year, responding again to Dominic Cummings, saying agree about Vallance and Whitty, they're the Chief Scientific and Medical Officers, on PPE. It's a disaster. I can't think of anything except taking Hancock off and putting Gove on. Now, presumably that means removing Hancock as Health Secretary and putting Michael Gove in instead. Is this from tonight focus groups and polls? Now, there are others, but at the moment, those are the ones that we have looked at. This is pretty serious for the Prime Minister. I don't ever remember seeing private messages in this way between a Prime Minister and any advisor.
Yeah, I mean, I think once the people closest to you turn on you and decide to go public, you have a major problem. Now, that's in any walk of life, let alone if you're the Prime Minister. And that's exactly what's happened here. Dominic Cummings, who was at the centre of decision-making, has all sorts of information. He says here that these are text messages, WhatsApp messages from the Prime Minister. We haven't heard from Downing Street yet about whether they're denying that they're true. But that's where we are now. And the point is here that when you heard Dominic Cummings' testimony to the Select Committee, it was very clear that it was Matt Hancock he blamed for an awful lot of problems. I mean,
he said he should have been fired, or at least 15 to 20
several
times.
times over. Now, when Matt Hancock gave his evidence, he said, I never lied to the Prime Minister. He absolutely denies doing that. And he said that he had the Prime Minister's support throughout all of this. If these WhatsApp messages are correct, and they are what they seem to be, then this shows the Prime Minister considering moving Matt Hancock and saying he could bring in Michael Gove and calling the Health Secretary hopeless. And that is a major problem for the Health Secretary, because this seems to go against what he said in that he had the Prime Minister's support. He's in still an incredibly sensitive and crucial position. This pandemic is ongoing, and this undermines that claim. So I think that is a problem for him. And it is, of course, a problem for the Prime Minister, because he now has a former advisor who is willing to, as you say, incredibly unusually, apparently publish very private messages at a time when the country was going through a national crisis.
Well, Paul Scully, we've known what Dominic Cummings, first of all, thinks about Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, and how he has performed during the pandemic. Now, it seems we know what Boris Johnson thinks of the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. He'll have to go, won't he?
I don't think it does say anything that I can't see it. I'm looking down the line, I'm looking at a blank screen.
Sure, but I've read what we have in front of us.
Absolutely, but what I'd say there's little context around that in terms of how it was, when it was said, at what point, and these kind of things. So we've basically had 7 hours of Dominic Cummings on primetime television giving evidence. We then had 4 hours of Matt Hancock giving evidence, and then we're still talking about special advisors' WhatsApps with the Prime Minister. What people are actually looking at now is, if they're looking in on this, the reason I didn't see a lot of Prime Minister's questions, because I was speaking to the chief execs of a lot of the pub and restaurant companies across the country. What they want to know is where we're going with this, how we're going to get the economy open, how we're going to get this this roadmap through in July.
They also want to know. They'll also want to know that the country is being run by competent government and competent cabinet ministers.
And I've worked with Matt Hancock on a regular basis.
Right, and you think he is. You don't think he's hopeless, then?
No, absolutely not. I've worked with Matt on a week-by-week basis, and I've seen him come from a hugely unprecedented challenge that nobody has had to face before. The world has suddenly had to face. Every country is facing similar issues, and to take that and to grow into the role and to really have command of the situation at the moment that I see on a day-to-day basis. I think he's doing a good job.
No, undoubtedly, in the case of the huge scale of the job. But you said you wanted to sort of give a bit of context. What context could there be to the Prime Minister saying that Matt Hancock is hopeless? What other context could there be?
I don't know if he's letting off steam. I don't know if there's some bigger stuff behind that. I just don't know from hearing about a single WhatsApp conversations, little snippets that Dominic Cummings is throwing in little grenades every now and again, because that's really important for the Westminster bubble. I'm not entirely sure it is for those who are worrying about their jobs, about their livelihoods, and indeed their health at the moment as we continue to face this big challenge.
OK, so it's just a case of letting off steam, and we shouldn't put
I don't
much
know
importance.
Is the honest answer, Joe. Joe, I don't know, because you just suddenly.
Are you shocked? Are you shocked to hear and see these rather explicit and perhaps honest WhatsApp messages?
I've been around Westminster and sort of like looked in on Westminster for 20 odd years, and I'm not really shocked at much of all about what comes around speculation rather than focusing on the core issues.
OK, listen, Luke Pollard, it is true. These are private messages. We've never quite seen the like of them being published in this way. Dominic Cummings has an axe to grind. Is the Labour Party now saying that they will take every word that Dominic Cummings says, and even when he is prepared to publish private texts, which could be a case of letting off steam, to use Paul Scully's words, and could just be banter between the Prime Minister and his chief advisor? They were never supposed to see the light of day.
I mean, these texts are extraordinary. I mean, I don't trust Dominic Cummings as far as I can throw him. However, it does seem that what he is saying here, and what he said is evidence about a government that's too slow to act to save lives and livelihoods, is now being matched up with evidence. And I think it's extraordinary that we seem to have a Prime Minister now that thought the health secretary was hopeless, but yet still kept him in post. He's still leading the pandemic response. What does that say about where we are at the moment? I don't think I agree with Paul in one respect. People want to see what's going on, but they also want a government that is going to be competent, that is going to be responsive. And at the moment, it looks like we have a government falling apart. We have a lack of trust between those people at the very top of the pandemic response. And that means surely they're not making the right decisions. And when you look at the poor nurses' pay, where you look at the failure to support care homes, when you look at the real problems to protect our borders, you can see that this government is too slow to act and is subject to rampant ministerial incompetence. It really is extraordinary.
Paul?
No, absolutely not. Well, I don't reckon. Where on earth do you get the fact that a government is falling apart? The government is head down, facing the biggest challenge that we've had in decades as a country, and doing it at pace, putting £407 billion worth of fiscal and financial support to keep the economy open, to making sure that we can protect lives and stop the NHS hospitalisations increase, to keep people safe and well as well. This is a government that's working together on all of these things, as well as business as usual around that.
Luke?
Yeah, it doesn't look like it, though, does it? I mean, the problem with this is we've got the Prime Minister's key advisor, who was in the room for all these discussions, washing the government's dirty laundry in public, highlighting the fact that the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary, politely put, are not getting on in this respect here, but actually are presiding over an incompetent response to the pandemic. I mean, if the Prime Minister did describe the Health Secretary as hopeless, why was he not sacked? Why was he not moved? Why was actions not taken on it? Because each of those actions could have saved lives. If he is as hopeless as the Prime Minister says, why was there not action taken earlier? The public really deserve better than this Tory psychodrama that's being played out, because it's being played out with the lives of people that we represent in Parliament. So let's get some proper action here.
Right, isn't that the point then, Paul? You can't dismiss it as a Westminster bubble story because of the things that Luke has just said. What went on between the Prime Minister and his top advisors and chief cabinet ministers, in this case the Health Secretary, could have had an impact on people's lives.
But again, we're taking this into one particular context. It could have, as you say, been banter, or it could have been frustration. It could be more than that. I don't know. But what I don't want to do, is to blow this out of proportion just because we've had one set of WhatsApps from Dominic Cummings. And as Luke has said, he doesn't trust the guy further than he can throw him, but suddenly he's his best mate because he's got something useful for the Labour Party to throw, rather than actually scrutinising the key things that people are asking the opposition to be scrutinising. That's what's going on now, and how we're going to fulfil step 4 of the roadmap and get back to a recovery for this country.
We haven't had a response, as you say, yet from Downing Street. They will have to respond, I presume, at some point later on. But what do you think they will be considering at this particular time?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, they're either going to have to say it's not true and it didn't happen, which, would be quite difficult. But if they say it didn't happen, then that will be one response. or they're going to have to say something like, well, look, everyone, as you said, lets off steam. There could be a moment where you're feeling incredibly frustrated. I think one of these was literally as the Prime Minister had been tested positive for COVID, and they can dismiss it in that sense, saying not everything went well. But what's interesting is that Dominic Cummings has come up with a number of questions that he thinks people should be asking the Prime Minister. But as you say, the main one is, if you really did think the Health Secretary was hopeless, why on earth didn't you move him? Why haven't you still moved him? And then there's still that question going back to the original plan A, if you like, this idea of herd immunity, letting lots of people get infected because they then have immunity from it. And he's accusing, very strongly here, the government of actually lying to Parliament about this and not admitting that was the case. And then there's the question of the PPE shortage. You'll remember Matt Hancock saying during that Select Committee hearing that actually there was no shortage of PPE nationally. There might have been local problems. Again, a question about that. Why didn't he do something about it?
We're going to talk about something different. Lord David Frost, the Minister responsible for Brexit, has been talking to MPs this morning about the Northern Ireland Protocol. That is, of course, part of the Brexit deal that governs Northern Ireland. Let's just take a look.
We obviously face a difficulty on the chilled meats issue. We have asked and suggested to the EU that the right way forward would be to agree to extend the grace period at least for a bit. If we can't agree it, we'll obviously have to consider all our options. There is, as far as we're aware, no risk of great British sausages ending up in the single market.
Vicky, you heard Lord Frost saying we'll have to consider all options. Do you think that could include unilaterally extending what we call the grace period for checks on chilled meats in this case?
Yeah, I mean, there's two different things here. One is the checks, because, of course, Northern Ireland is still following EU rules. The rest of the United Kingdom isn't. That's why you need to have checks on some things. When it comes to chilled meat, it's simply banned. The EU doesn't allow chilled meats in from countries beyond the single market. So, that's a major problem here. Now, in 2 weeks' time, the unilateral, the grace period that's been given over all of this is up. Now, you'd imagine that on past record, the UK will again do what it's done before, which is unilaterally decide that they just simply won't follow the rules. Remember, the EU is already taking the UK to court. Yes. They have already launched legal action. Now, as we all know, that takes years, potentially. You get the impression that the UK government is just thinking, well, we'll continue to do that. The legal action rolls on for a long time. Or do they try and come to some compromise over medicines, which lots of people will think is more important than sausages? Medicines, it looks like the EU might be willing to say, we'll change our rules on that. So you could allow medicines to go, say, from London to Northern Ireland. But this is an ongoing problem. There isn't a lot of trust there. And I don't think that the G7 summit helped that with the war of words between Emmanuel Macron and Dominic Raab.
Right. And as you say, I think we heard also from Lord Frost that there hasn't been much progress made so far. Paul, is that the plan, that the UK will unilaterally extend that grace period to stop the ban on chilled meats going from GB to Northern Ireland?
Well, I think we're trying to have those pragmatic conversations. I think that's the important thing to concentrate on at the moment, because there are clearly a number of issues that are arising out of the protocol and what we've learned now, having been in this trading situation for a few months now. There was some issues over January that in terms of business readiness, that we were able to work through. There's obviously bigger changes, just what happens when you leave the customs union, any customs union single market. But there's this big chunk in the middle, which is when the protocol clearly isn't working as intended for either side in many instances. And so these are the bits that we've really got to focus on in terms of pragmatic and cordial discussions.
Right. Okay.
Well, dial down the temperature a bit and really have those temperature to make sure that we can get it working for businesses either side.
Well, Luke, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, earlier this week on Monday, said we've got to find a way forward. Well, everyone agrees on that. Having checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is not the way forward. Having any checks between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is absolutely not the way forward. What does he mean?
I think it means looking at how agreements can be made between the United Kingdom and the European Union that would allow that. For instance, an agreement on food standards or an agreement on veterinary checks. And so there are options available.
So you want to align with EU rules?
Well, I think agreements can be made between the UK and the EU that would get us into a better place. The problem is they were not included deliberately in the withdrawal agreement.
Yeah, which you signed up to.
Which
you signed up to, of course, the Labour Party. So I don't quite understand how this plan of Keir Starmer's works.
Indeed, I would have preferred a better deal to have voted for to prevent no deal, but that was the rubbish deal that was on the table, I'm afraid. But it does mean that there are still options that the government should be exploring. They deliberately chose not to have those in the deal, but we're seeing the problems that were predicted well in advance of the deal coming to fruition. We're seeing the Prime Minister's absence from this debate causing real difficulties because he personally negotiated this deal. He personally sold it to the country and he's responsible for the consequences. That's why I think I would like him to take a bigger role in what's taking place here. I'd like him to respect the Good Friday Agreement a lot more, but we need to get this sorted because at the moment it's completely unsustainable and the government should act to sort it out.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to both of you and, of course, to Vicky Young for joining me today. And I will be back tomorrow with Politics Live at 12:15. Please join me then. Bye-bye.